Great. Thank you. Thank you, Rami, for inviting me to chair this session. Yeah, my name is Hussam Timani. I'm a professor of Islamic Studies at Krestovfer Newport University in Virginia. And yeah, I'm very happy to chair this session. So we have 2 panels and 3 presenters. What we're going to do is do the presentations first and then open the floor for discussions. Each presentation, we can have up to 20 minutes for each presentation. All right, so let me, so we're going to start with Dr. إريك. So let me introduce the presenter, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lob. All right. Dr. Lob is an associate professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University. His research focuses on the intersections of politics and development in Iran and the Middle East and the Global South. He is the author of the book Iran's Reconstruction Jihad, Rural Development and Regime Consolidation After 1979 by Cambridge Press. His articles have appeared in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, Iranian Studies, Middle East Critique, the Middle East Journal, the Muslim World, Third World Quarterly, and others. Dr. Lob will present his paper titled The Role of the Syrian Druze Diaspora Community in Strengthening Relations Between Venezuela and its Middle East Allies. Dr. Lob, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Hussam. And I was actually at your Middle East conference last year, so it's good to see you again.
Yeah, that's right. I remember the face and the name.
Yes.
All right, great.
And I'd like to thank Rami and the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen so that you could see my presentation. Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Okay. If you want me to switch to slideshow, please let me know. But anyway, I slightly modified the title of my paper because in addition to looking at the role of political elites from the Syrian diaspora community, many of whom are Druze, and that's why it relates to this conference, I also, and their role in reinforcing relations with the Middle East, I also look at their political trajectory in Venezuela since the rise of Chavez and Maduro, relating back to Hussam's kind introduction, I should say. I've worked for a long time on Iran's domestic politics and foreign policy, and increasingly, my research has focused on Iran's relations, along with other of Iran's allies and partners in the Middle East, relations with the countries of Latin America, specifically Venezuela being the largest and most important partnership in that relationship. Like I said, in terms of the research questions that this paper seeks to answer, I look at the trajectory of political elites from the Syrian Druze diaspora community in Venezuela. I'll get into a bit of the history of this community. Their role or lack thereof in helping Venezuela, Chavez and Maduro reinforce relations with the Middle East to advance both ideational and material interests. And interestingly, looking at intra-communal convergences, but also divergences concerning these relations within the Syrian Druze diaspora community in Venezuela. The beginning of the paper gets into a little bit of my past research in terms of looking at relations primarily between Venezuela, Iran, and Syria, of course, under the Assad regime up until late 2024, at a top-down and macro level. I'm not going to get into it too much now since we have time constraints, but it looks at how over time, starting in the 2000s, how this relationship was established, how it expanded, and even how it vacillated during different presidencies with Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, with multiple presidents in Iran since 2000, starting with Khatami and Mohammad Khatami and moving forward. And then, of course, where we've seen the greatest consistency is with Bashar al-Assad and his regime, which had been around for quite a bit of time until just recently. The first part of the paper really looks at how this relationship was shaped and impacted by two factors: the perceptions and preferences of these different presidents that I mentioned, and then at a structural or systemic level, how external pressures in the form of U.S. sanctions and fluctuating petroleum prices, which particularly Venezuela and Iran largely depend on, even Syria to some extent, how that influence proximity and distance within this relationship. And actually I have an article, if you're interested, that I recently published in the journal Middle East Critique that really exclusively looks at these relations from a state-to-state level and from a more of a macro perspective. So, again, the paper looks at the periodization of this relationship expansion under Chavez and Khatami, as I mentioned earlier, how it peaked in the mid-2000s and early 2010s under Chavez, Ahmadinejad, and al-Assad. And there was a vacillation, particularly with Iran focusing on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and with an Iran nuclear deal and distancing itself a little bit from Venezuela in Maduro in the 2010s. And then, of course, once the U.S. withdraws from the JCPOA and reimposes sanctions on Iran, we see a rapprochement between Iran and Venezuela and Syria, not just under President Ra'isi, which we would expect to see given his background and disposition, but also even the second term of Rouhani when this happened. So, that gets into the first part of the paper. Here are some images, of course, the peak of these relations under the populist and anti-imperialist presidencies of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iran and Chavez in Venezuela, and then under President Ra'isi, who passes away in a helicopter crash in 2024. But before that, in the first year of his presidency in 2021, these relations again culminate in the signing of a 20-year cooperation plan between Iran and Venezuela on multiple fronts, on diplomatically, militarily, politically, economically. So it's a pretty big deal. So then the paper really starts to get into, really tries to drill down more at a meso and micro level inside and outside of Venezuela in terms of looking at, which is really an understudied subject, the history and political role and trajectory of Syrian migrants in Venezuela. That Syrians constitute the largest group of Arab migrants in Venezuela. It's difficult to find more recent statistics, but as of 2012-13, they were about 3% of the population. Most of them are actually Druze, which is again why this paper relates to this conference, which actually, interestingly, is the largest diaspora community of its kind outside the Middle East. As of 2021, they numbered 60,000 or so. And this history of migration dates back to the late 19th century, where we had a first wave of Druze Christians and Jews who fled persecution during the last years of the Ottoman Empire. And since then, we've seen a steady flow of these migrants to Venezuela. We had a second wave during the oil boom in the 1950s, where more Syrians joined older generations who had been there, and their descendants who had largely assimilated into the country in different ways, but still to some extent kept their Arab identity through cuisine, culture, literature, and other aspects, to some extent linguistics as well. And then in the early 2000s, we actually start to see when Bashar al-Assad comes to power, takes over from his father, Hafez al-Assad, we actually start to see a reverse wave of migration where Syrians start to go back from Venezuela to Syria, to cities like Al-Suwaida, which has obviously gotten a lot of attention recently with the sectarian violence that we see there between the Sunni-led government and Druze factions in that area, to other cities as well. And it's really not necessarily a permanent wave. Many of these individuals, actually, the nickname of Asueda is Little Venezuela, and a lot of the Druze and Syrians there have both Syrian and Venezuelan passports and go back and forth. So it's really a bi-directional flow more than a permanent unidirectional one. So then in terms of looking at political elites who have emerged from this community, to the extent that we can get data on this, obviously the critical juncture in this is the rise of Hugo Chavez as president, which is really seen as a revolution against long-standing wealthy and white elites in the country who had been backed by the United States and by other Western powers as part of this neoliberal capitalist order. And Chavez's rise is really against that status quo elite. And as Chavez gains greater momentum among his followers and supporters, it really becomes a political opportunity for socio-political mobility and personal prestige for these political elites from the Syrian diaspora community, both Druze and non-Druze, inside Venezuela. And it actually is very reminiscent of, if you've read Theda Skocpol's work on social revolutions and on this concept of marginal elites. Up until that point, the members of this community were very much a marginal elite in terms of being successful middle-class citizens, but excluded from the higher echelons of the economy and the political establishment. And so this is really an opportunity. This creates an opening for them, very much like we see in other social revolutions, for them to experience this mobility and this prestige, particularly on a political level, even economic one that they and social one that they hadn't been able to before. And so, like many marginal elites that Skocpol writes about, these individuals emerge from the middle class. They're university students who support Chavez and even study under some of his relatives at these different universities. And then once Chavez comes to power, they're actually able to enter the government and its different branches. And some of them also, not only do they have prominent positions in the state, but even in civil society associations that have been established to promote the rights of and advocate for Arabs in Venezuela, and also relations between Venezuelan Syrians, other Arabs, and Syria and other countries. So some of these elites are actually not just in a position of power now under the new regime, but they're also positioned to establish, expand, and even reinforce relations with Venezuela's emerging allies and partners in the region, which does undergo a shift from Arab Gulf states and other states to really if you're familiar, the axis of resistance, Iran, Syria, and even non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, and other groups, which Chavez squarely puts himself into that camp. These individuals, just like Venezuela does with the rise of Chavez, and again, there's no, they're going to pay a price for overthrowing the status quo ancien regime. They're under tremendous pressure by the United States and Western countries. And this really manifests itself at a micro level in the form of allegations by these countries. And of course, some of these allegations could be substantiated of authoritarianism, of repression, and criminal activity inside and outside of Venezuela. And they are subjected to all sorts of sanctions, bans, and legal accusations by the United States and its allies. So I've gone through, and just for the interest of time, I'll talk about the most prominent members of the Syrian Druze. Really, in this case, two of the three most prominent figures are actually from the Syrian Druze diaspora community. The first one being Tariq al-Assami, who's a Syrian Druze and Lebanese descent. As I mentioned before, he was a law student and a Chavista activist at the university. He studied under one of Chavez's relatives. And through this experience, he actually met Chavez at the university. And as I write here, he studied under his brother. And then once Chavez came to power, he actually rose to the highest echelons of the executive branch, and was occupied positions where he was a minister for various ministries, and then went all the way up to the level of vice president as well under Chavez and Maduro. Interestingly, his even though he came from Syria and Lebanon, and perhaps as a Druze because he did, his great uncle and father had important positions not in Syria, but actually in Syria's rival, or the Assad family's rival in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And so his great uncle was the leader of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, and his father was the chair of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party in Venezuela, and was connected to leftist movements in the Middle East. So there's an interesting complexity and contradiction here, where many families, individuals and families from this community actually fled socialism, authoritarian socialist regimes in the Middle East, to find more political freedom and opportunity in Venezuela, particularly with its thriving petroleum sector. But there were some individuals in this community, like Al-Assami's father, who actually, where socialism, Chavez's socialist ideology and worldview resonated with him, due to his affiliation with the Ba'ath Party and with leftist movements. So anyway, in the 1990s, there's Chavez stages a failed coup. Al-Assami's father is arrested in Venezuela. He moves to Iraq to join his uncle. And then after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, his father returns to Venezuela, where he tries to support Saddam Hussein in exile, and he's very critical of the U.S. invasion and occupation. So once Al-Assami comes to power as minister and vice president, there's allegations that he's involved, I mean, not just engaging and trying to expand relations with allies in the Middle East on the part of Venezuela, but he's also involved in illicit activities like money laundering. At one point in the 2000s and 2010s, he's the head of Venezuela's Passport and Naturalization Agency, where he sells passports, or at least his agency is responsible for selling passports to Middle Easterners. And apparently this also includes members of Hamas and Hezbollah, which Venezuela develops relations with. And when he's governor of the state of Aragua, there's military cooperation with Iran in that state by the Venezuelan military industrial complex, where they cooperate with Iran in developing drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, and other projects, which had been going on actually for quite some time, since the years of Khatami in the early 2000s. As I mentioned, Al-Assami is under tremendous pressure by the United States as one of the key figures around Chavez and Maduro. He's accused of corruption, money laundering, drug trafficking inside and outside the Middle East. He's subjected to Western sanctions. But interestingly enough, and maybe because of this pressure and to try to alleviate it, and maybe also at the orders of Maduro, who also wants to alleviate pressure on his government and improve the economy, that he actually cooperates with Chevron on trying to make a deal to put more Venezuelan oil on the international market, and to in exchange for trying to move Venezuela in a more democratic direction, which doesn't happen as we see with the most recent election under Maduro. And then the U.S. withdraws that sanctions relief and reimposes sanction. Another interesting thing, and I'll get into this in a few minutes, is that in 2023, he's forced to resign. And not only that, but he's actually arrested by the Venezuelan authorities on charges of treason, corruption, money laundering, and criminal association. And there's lots of questions that are raised about this. And it's actually very interesting, who arrests Al-Assami, a very interesting part of this story. So here's a picture of Assami if you haven't seen him before. And here's a picture of the Venezuelan-Iranian drone cooperation that had happened when he was governor, and even beyond that. The second prominent figure is Tariq William Saab, who whereas Al-Assami rose to prominence in the executive branch, Saab rises to prominence in the judicial branch. And he's still currently Attorney General of Venezuela. and very close associate of President Maduro. Similar to El-Assami, he's of Syrian and Lebanese Druze descent, although he actually, unlike El-Assami, he deviated from the Druze faith and at some point converted to Zen Buddhism, which may explain certain parts of his positionality vis-a-vis El-Assami. Like El-Assami, he studied law and supported Chavez in the 1980s and 90s, and rose to prominence very, very much in a similar path as El-Assami. In 2002, there was a failed coup attempt against Chavez, and he was detained for multiple hours. What's interesting about Saab is he was beyond being a lawyer and a political activist, he was also a very prominent literary figure and intellectual and writer. And during a literature fair in Havana, that was attended by both Chavez and Fidel Castro at the time, they called Saab the poet of the revolution. So, he really rose to prominence through his literary work, which ironically was actually inspired by the United States of the 1960s, the hippie counterculture and the beat writers of the United States. He spent some time in the executive branch as the governor of an oil-rich state, and then goes through rises through the political establishment through various appointments in the National Assembly, where he's appointed ombudsman. And at the time, he actually is accused of siding with the government. Where, even as ombudsman, if he's supposed to be independent from the executive branch, he very much comes out on the side of the government during these protests in 2014, 2017. And there's actually a famous video, widely watched video of his son going on YouTube and saying that he condemns his father for this. Although when you talk to Venezuelans, they think that maybe he did this for his own protection as opposed to doing it out of his own personal conviction. Finally, in 2017, he's appointed Attorney General, where he still has this position to this day by the Constituent Assembly, and replaces the non-loyalist, who basically Luisa Ortega Diaz. And interestingly enough, as well, in a very hypocritical, contradictory fashion, he's appointed also to president of this Truth Commission that is really responsible during the years of Maduro for rooting out political opponents and intellectuals, even though he himself was one and is one. Like El-Assami, he faces all sorts of pressure with sanctions, entry bans, expulsion orders from the United States and its allies and partners. The UN questions his independence as Attorney General, which was another issue that was raised when he was ombudsman. And then getting back to the story where he actually, as Attorney General in 2023, he actually is the one who arrests El-Assami when he's petroleum minister on these corruption charges. And so the question is why? Why does this happen? And the simple explanation, and of course I'm still trying to think through this, and maybe some of you have other ideas, is that at this point, with these individuals having risen so high at the echelon of political power, one explanation, the simple one, may just be that politics and power trump identity politics or supersede them, right? That even though both of them come from the same community, at the end of the day, they're going to do what's in their best interests. If Maduro had instructed Saab to do this, or even Saab himself saw an opportunity to get rid of a potential political rival. But when you dig deeper as well, there's obviously, if we think about identity here, there is divergence. As I mentioned, Saab was also converted to Zen Buddhism, and unlike El-Assami, strayed from his faith. And for that reason, we actually see a divergence here in terms of El-Assami in not only maintaining his identity as someone from the Syrian Druze diaspora community, but also someone who engaged in the Middle East. Unlike Saab, we never see any of those activities. And so they're also from the standpoint of identity, this divergence may also explain why Saab didn't think twice about arresting and imprisoning al-Assami. Even though, again, we're not going to necessarily say that al-Assami's engagement with the Middle East was done on a noble level. There was, of course, as I said, he engaged in illicit activity in the Middle East. But even beyond that, there's reports that he was involved in corrupt activities when he was head of the Venezuelan passport agency. That there's another Syrian legislator or a political figure. I don't know if I have time to talk about him, but he actually wrote a letter to Chavez accusing, well, indirectly, let's say, without mentioning al-Assami's name. 2 minutes, okay. al-Assami's name without mentioning it, about his being upset or disappointed with Venezuela overcharging Syrian citizens for Venezuelan passports. So even though al-Assami, and this gets all very complicated and is full of contradictions, even though al-Assami, unlike Saab, engaged the Middle East, there were also moments where he engaged the Middle East within the context of corruption, and also at the expense of Syrian citizens and other Middle Easterners as well, that paid very high fees for Venezuelan passports. So just to wrap up, because I was going to get into, and here's a picture of Saab, I was going to get into another figure, but I won't have time to do it now. This was just a parliamentarian. He's not Druze, but he was one of key figures in parliament from the Syrian diaspora community, who, while he was a parliamentarian, he actually went back to Syria, not only to tend to his sick mother, but also to fight in the Syrian civil war on the side of Bashar al-Assad and his regime. And here you see a picture of him holding a Kalashnikov while he's in battle and in action. So here's an example of very direct personal and political engagement by someone from this community in Syria on the side of the Assad regime. So again, just to conclude with the points, the rise of Chavez and Maduro, and again, it's very difficult to quantify how many individuals from this community rose to political prominence, like al-Assami and Saab. But nonetheless, the rise of Chavez and Maduro was a political opportunity for members of this community, of political elites, for socio-political mobility and personal prestige. As I mentioned, it's not just a story of these people rising to power and then helping Venezuela on a wholesale level engage with the Middle East. There's all types of complexities and contradictions in this story involving these individuals. As individuals that are very closely associated with the president and the top figures of this regime, and as a microcosm of the Venezuelan government more broadly, they're under tremendous pressure by the United States and its allies and partners. We also see, another cost of this, in that there's intracommunal conflict between them at times, infighting between them, adding to the complexity of this story. And then finally, a question that I have, and I'll wrap up here with this last point, is thinking about moving forward, how the rapid regional changes we've seen in the Middle East could have an impact on this story in terms of the weakening of Iran, its partners and proxies in the region, the swift fall of the Assad regime in December of 2024. To what extent does it now impact these relations that have really been around since 2000? And then to what extent does it also affect or influence the status of the Syrian diaspora community, Druze and non-Druze, inside of Venezuela? Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
All right, great. Thank you, Eric, for a very interesting presentation and quite revealing. All right, so we're going to move to the second presentation, and I see Dr. Minerva. Is Dr. Nina Maadad with us? Oh, okay. I can't hear you, Minerva. Can you unmute? Can you unmute
Good
yourself?
morning.
Okay.
Good morning from South Australia.
Oh, okay. So you're Nina, right?
No, I'm Nina.
I'm Minerva.
Oh, okay, because we have okay. So both of you with us. Okay, all right. So yes, let me introduce. So we have two presenters. So I'm gonna introduce the presenters. Dr. Nina Maadad's PhD was based on psychological and psychosocial aspects of migrants to Australia. She published a monograph titled Adaptation of Arab Immigrants to Australia based on her research. Dr. Maadad has also written a book titled Schooling and Education in Lebanon. She has published on Arabic-speaking refugees in 5 countries: Australia, Italy, Indonesia, Lebanon, and Turkey. Dr. Minerva Nasser-eddine has published on the geopolitics of the Middle East and North Africa and the role ethnic minorities play in regional developments. She has an interest in the identity politics of ethnic minorities and their status in the MENA region, and considers the intersect between diaspora communities and their connections with their birth countries. Dr. Nasser-eddine is also known for her work in and among multicultural communities, especially Arabic-speaking communities in Australia. The connection between the global developments and its impact locally has been under long considerations. The presentation titled In Their Own Voices, Druze Migration to Australia. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Nina.
Yeah, just a short introduction, but sorry, I don't know why they're mixed with the names as well, but we're in 2 different places. We're looking forward for the presentation. Thank you for the few that we've heard this morning. And Minerva, you go ahead and start with this.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Rami, and all the organisers, and Dr. Hussam for the kind introduction. We're delighted to be part of this esteemed panel and this conference. I'll just share my screen. Sorry. There always has to be a couple of tech gremlins, right? And we appreciate that it's the end of a long day for you all, and we hope that the presentation ahead will provide a bit of oxygen to the room and to where you're placed at the moment. Can everyone see the screen now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Fantastic, yes. Wonderful. We've retitled this particular presentation, I Promise I'll Be Back, and it comes, it falls within a larger project that Nina and I are working on. But the title itself, the current title, I'll Promise I'll Be Back, comes from a novel written in 2002 by Gerard called Somewhere Home. And as I was reading the novel, a particular line really struck me, and that is, and I quote, "Then he lifted both his hands above his head and waved to the cars as they drove away. Ada put her head out of the window and shouted to him, 'I'll be back, Abu Mahmoud. I promise I'll be back.'" So how many, and that led to me asking the question, and Nina and I had a conversation in terms of how many of the migrants that do in fact migrate to Australia and beyond do in fact go back. Is the journey in fact real or imaginary, temporary or permanent? Is it voluntary, filled with hesitation, trepidation and excitement? Or has one been forced into involuntary exile, forever yearning the motherland? Or do these pre-migration memories remain a distant and rarely revisited history, a conscious or subconscious detachment? And how do these factors contribute to a migrant settlement journey, sense of belonging and continued identity formation? So as a result of these questions being asked, Nina and I decided to undertake a study trying to address some of these questions, and the study itself is called, In Our Own Voices, Druze Migration in South Australia. The study captures the migration story of the Druze community to South Australia in their own voices. Their stories help the nation further understand immigration and the value immigrants add to the life in Australia from a cultural, social and economic perspective. And this study also commences from the post-World War II period to the present and navigates migrants' experiences in a constantly evolving and maturing multicultural and multi-faith Australian society. Initially, Nina and I had thought of looking at Druze migration to Australia and South Australia specifically from first records which suggest the early migrants arrived in South Australia as early as the 1890s. However, there's quite a significant archival material available to us, and unfortunately we just didn't have the luxury of resources or time to undertake that in the way that we ideally would like to do. So we thought, in order to capture the stories of those that are still with us, and Nina will unpack this in her part of the presentation shortly, that we will commence with the period post-World War II to the present. And also within this project, we seek to explore the themes of identity, memory and trauma through the personal narratives of our study participants as they navigate their lives far from a place they once called home. So the study captures or rather sets out to describe and explain the presence of the Druze community in South Australia and the cultural, material and philosophical contributions of its people and what they have contributed to the state at large. The population here in South Australia is difficult to put an exact figure to. There has been no internal census undertaken within the community itself, and the national census that takes place in Australia every 5 years it doesn't necessarily capture all the Druze because people don't necessarily identify themselves as Druze on the census for various reasons, one of them being potentially the discrimination, but also in terms of the identifier had only been placed into the census in the most recent 2 census. So it's difficult to ascertain how many Druze there are in Australia. In Australia at large, the figure largely quoted is around 20,000. And here in South Australia and Adelaide, our capital, it's noted that there are between 3,000 and 4,000 people of Druze heritage. The Druze pioneers made many contributions to the history of certain towns in South Australia over the years. In the areas of agriculture, they predominantly arrived and worked as hawkers, that is, selling haberdashery and bits and pieces that people in rural South Australia couldn't necessarily obtain because of the lack of small businesses in those areas. And then from there, they progressed into establishing bricks and mortar businesses and in turn became successful small business operators in rural South Australia and eventually moved to the capital Adelaide and have been instrumental in contributing to small business operations here in South Australia. In more recent times, they have left significant marks in medicine. Professor Amal Bouhamdan, and we'll see an image of her shortly. The trades, small business, as I mentioned earlier, particularly the Hamouds, Bashirs and Rashid families, but also in law, such as, again, members of the Bashir family, the Salha family and the Najjar family, and in sports. Just recently, we had the passing of Max Bashir at the age of 97 years old, and he was instrumental in being an administrator in a local football league in South Australia. And there's also, of course, Roger Rashid, who was an international tennis player. In addition to that, there are also significant Druze who have made their mark in both education and government sectors. The research will also contribute to the record keeping of the history of migration of the Druze people to Australia, how and why their migration originated and where they settled, and how they built their new lives in a rapidly changing Australian society. The history and stories shared in this study will be one of many recounted of journeys of migrants to Australia, and in this case the subject is predominantly under-researched and barely explored migration journey of the Druze to Australia. So our intent is to publish this research into a book, and we're hoping that that will be finalised in the new year. The stories help the nation understand immigration and the value immigrants add to life in Australia from a cultural, social and economic perspectives. And the periods under review, as mentioned earlier, commences from the World War II period right through to the present. The study intends to examine various migration waves to Australia per generation, commencing in the 1950s to 60s, through the 1970s, and then post-Lebanese Civil War, and then to 2015, from the post-Lebanese Civil War period to around the 2015 period. The study will collate, examine and analyse records of the history of migration of the Druze people to Australia, specifically how and why their migration originated and settlement experiences that followed. The Druze migration experience into Australia varied over time, particularly when faced with changing public policy. For instance, the Druze who migrated during the 1950s and 60s were forced to assimilate and minimise their public-facing Druze identity, and many were forced to anglicise their names. So that's why the likes of Farid became Fred and Rafiq became Ray, for instance. Whilst those who migrated in the 1970s, such as my parents, they arrived at a time when Australia's multiculturalism was evolving and were able to contribute to Australia's rich multicultural, multi-ethnic and multi-faith society. And just a quick example of that, there was no need to anglicise their names upon arrival or soon upon settlement. And it was interesting that my father would come from Beit Nasser-eddine, and my father actually shortened his name to Nasser. So legally he's known as Afif Nasser as opposed to Afif Nasser-eddine here in Australia. And when I opted to retain our full surname, he asked me, why are you doing that? And I said, I'm proud of the surname and I would like to be known as Minerva Nasser-eddine as opposed to Minerva Nasser. He said, but ya binti, my daughter, it's much easier for people to pronounce Nasser. They think of Nasser, in the US, the Astronomical Association, or Aerospace Association rather. So they'll just refer to you as Nasser. So how much easier will that be for you rather than them trying to pronounce Nasser-eddine? But I stood my ground, and yes, there have been individuals who have had difficulty pronouncing the name, but that's part and parcel of the society that we live in here in Australia, and I'm very proud to have retained that surname as opposed to shortening it or anglicising it. What's also similar, what we also have found in terms of our similarities with Eric's presentation that he was kind enough to share prior to ours, was that also as a result of some of the political tensions that have happened in the various homelands that many of the Druze migrants come from, that in turn has affected community dynamics here in South Australia. And of course, the developments that are occurring within the MENA region today have also impacted on social cohesion, which is being tested in a climate of misinformation, disinformation, and global conflicts impacting domestically. And Australia's multiculturalism and cohesion is being tested, and this research will attempt to capture some of these new and emerging issues. So these are just some of the images that we've captured from some of the study participants who have kindly volunteered to contribute. And the bulk of the migrants that came to South Australia arrived in the post-World War II period, largely in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, and some in the 60s. And then the second wave came in the 1970s during the Civil War. However, the bulk of the groundwork, if you like, was effectively established by the communities, or the pioneers, as we refer to them, in the 1950s, and these are just some of the images of those individuals. So I'll now pass on to Nina.
Thank you, Minerva. Thanks. Looking at some of the research, the study that we're doing, we looked at some gaps. Sadly, in Australia, there is no official collection of Druze migration history to detail the reasons why the migration has happened to Australia. Why Australia? As a matter of fact, the early settlers, as we've mentioned before, were all classified early stages as Turks, and then later, a few years later, they started being classified as Syrian, and it took a long time in Australia to start saying Lebanese. There are very few generations, older generations, that are still alive, unfortunately, and their stories and memories are very important to be heard and to be followed, for people to know exactly what happened and how these stories happened. So as Minerva mentioned, Max Bashir, may he rest in peace, there are a number of people still alive in their 90s. And we're lucky enough to be able to share some of their experiences and listen to their stories as well. There are no published studies that has been undertaken examining the Druze acculturation and experiences after settlement. Therefore, further developing migration research methodologies and pedagogies seems to be really important. The first time a study has been undertaken in Australia was to examine the evolving sense of identity among Druze migrants and their own reconciliation between their Druze and Australian identity. And we're getting some amazing stories from people on how they feel about who they are and how they connect their Lebanese, Druze, and Australian identities, allowing new knowledge to emerge about how migrants from positive communities' identities settled. Thanks, Minerva.
All right. Thank you for a great presentation. And so now, yeah, anything you want to add?
Yeah, actually, we have a few more slides to go through.
I'm sorry, I thought you're, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So the study that we're doing, the methodology that we're following, utilizes a mixed method approach to explore migration and the influence on factor by combining personal memoirs, interviews, case studies, questionnaires, and journals. This data that we're collecting allows us to understand deeper examples, get deeper understanding of how minority cultures, specifically the Druze community integrate into dominant cultures while considering family dynamics, cultural background, and historical context. Interviews with Druze individuals from Lebanon and Syria revealed their migration experiences and adaptation in life in Australia, especially Adelaide. Participants share personal memoirs and journals that illustrated their emotional journey, including the trauma of leaving home and the hope of new beginnings. The study highlights the significance of core values: religion, peoplehood, and historicity. Formulated by Smolich, we went back to looking at essential for cultural preservation amidst challenges. Overall, it emphasizes the importance of humanistic sociology in analyzing individual perspectives within the broader social and cultural implications of migration. So when we looked at the historical migration and looked at early settlement, in the early stages, the Druze community began migrating to South Australia in the late 1800s, with approximately 50 Druze individuals recorded by the 1900s. They were often classified as Turks, as I mentioned earlier, due to their origins within the Ottoman Empire. The first official mention of Druze in Australia, in South Australia, occurred during the 1891 religious census. Yet identifying accurate statistics remained challenging due to changing national identities and a preference for privacy among communities. In the 19th century, which roughly by 1939, the number of Druze immigrants in South Australia has increased to around 1,000, and broader Lebanese migration waves increased. The migration patterns were influenced by religious persecution and societal conflicts in Lebanon. So the Lebanese Druze experienced transformations in identity, especially after Lebanon gained independence in 1943, and the classification of immigrants in census also after the independence. So that data evolved to better reflect their origins. The Druze community continued to grow post-1945, paralleling other ethnic groups while navigating challenges in Australian immigration and policies. From assimilation to multiculturalism, the complexities in identity persisted, amplified by the civil war in Lebanon and tensions between Syrian and Lebanese Druze. Recent migrations have brought in educated and progressive individuals, all emphasizing the Druze identity, influencing community dynamics, and integration into the multicultural landscape of modern Australia. Thank you, Minerva. Can you please? These are some photos that they've shared with us as well for parties and things that they attend. The core, what am I up to, Minerva? During the Druze migration began in the late 19th centuries, as we said before. Within initial settlers like Yusuf Saifuddin, Salman Najjar, they established businesses in South Australia after arriving in 1892. Many early Druze migrants returned to Lebanon to marry, creating connection that facilitated further migration. By the 1920s, the community was growing as men who had settled began to bring their wives to Australia. The establishment of the first Syrian Lebanese Druze Society in 1926 signified the community's organizational efforts to support newcomers. Post-World War II, migration saw a significant increase in the Druze individuals, seeking better opportunities amid rising tensions in Lebanon. Their adaptability allowed them to integrate well into Australian society while maintaining their core values, their core cultural values. The strong sense of communal identity has enabled Druze Australians to preserve their traditional and contribute to various community endeavours, including building infrastructures like the Druze Hall in North Adelaide. This growing community has continually enriched Australia's multicultural landscape while reinforcing connections to their heritage. So in the 1970s, can you please go one slide, Minerva? So some of the contemporary challenges, as mentioned before, were the generational conflicts. Our findings that we started, that's okay, Minerva, you can go back to that slide. Minerva, you can go to the next one, please.
The contemporary challenges in identity.
No, it's okay. Just go to the Hamid, the last one, the Hamdan. Yeah. As you can see in here, we have a few photos as well that people have shared with us. And due to the nature of the Tawhid faith, very few interviewees are aware of its detail. Rather, tradition and humanistic values and practices were identified and generally practiced. So many people do the interviews, the small number of interviews that we have transcribed so far from a number of them. They say to us that when we ask, how do you see yourself? And how do you compare your Lebanese self to Australian self? And it is actually overwhelmingly, people see themselves as Lebanese first, Druze second, and Australian third. But they also say that Lebanese Australian when you first ask them. So they're proud to identify their Druze identity. However, it's not necessarily volunteered unless they were asked. The desire to retain their Druze practices seemed very strong, especially more stronger with the recent arrivals. So they're trying to hang on to that and keep that. Concern for the future of Druze community in the diaspora and in the Middle East was acute, also in some of the responses. Talking about integration into Australian society was effortless. People felt that they belong here as well as their Druze community amongst all, probably 80% of those that we've interviewed shared that. An example of broader community participants, whether through voluntary work, sport work, or club participations, was all identified.
Okay, so 2 minutes.
That's it. Never.
Oh, that's it. All right, great. Thank you, Minerva and Nina. All right, so yeah, before we open the floor for discussion and questions, so I just have a question about each presentation. So Eric, a question: how has the Syrian Druze diaspora community's inclusion in the Venezuelan government, whether under Chavez or Maduro, impacted the community's socioeconomic status within Venezuela?
That's a great question. You know, in terms of, to be honest with you, I don't have an answer. You know, that would be a question for future research. It's an excellent question, right? I mean, the question is, without having gone to Venezuela or spoken to many members, if any, of the community. Whether the rise, as I talked about, the rise of Maduro or Chavez and Maduro was a political opportunity for very specific elites. And again, I don't even have a number beyond these key figures. And in the paper, I do have names of others. So it's not just these three figures, but there's others that rise as well in the different branches of government, even some of whom are already associates of Assami, Saab, and others, right? But the question is this really a gain for these very specific individuals from this community? Or has this also allowed the community more broadly to experience to benefit from this, the change, the regime change in the country, even under all the pressure that it faces, all the economic adversity? Or are these individuals outliers, right? And to some extent, because I've seen this happen before in politics. Like, for example, we could think about it in many different contexts, right? But like for example, when I study Iran, there are certain politicians, including the supreme leader himself, who come from an ethnic minority community. But over time, there's a separation there. And there's even resentment among members of the community saying that, even though he's one of us, he belongs to a very specific group or clique. And he really none of the spoils came to us. There was no trickle down effect. And not only is there, there's a distance over time between these elites and their communities, but even resentment, that this meteoric rise of these political elites didn't necessarily bring substantive positive social economic change, and if anything, may have even in some ways made things worse for these communities. So it's a very important question you ask. I don't have an answer to it, and I'm sure, just like the rest of this story, it's complicated. Because, like, for example, El Assami's family, his sister also was, part of this story, where she was a lawyer. She rose to power with him. She occupied very important positions in the government, as an ambassador, and in other capacities, right? But again, like, is this the story of a very specific set of individuals, their families, right? That seems to be, when I read about this topic, which is fairly new to me, they frame it as really looking at the central unit of analysis as a family or clan, as this political story, at least, versus a whole a wider story of the community at large. And just as we see kind of infighting at the political level, and as the other presentation mentioned, between El Assami, Saab, and even this parliamentarian who's very critical of El Assami and what he does in the region, I'm sure that there's a lot of debates within the community in terms of the extent to what extent these individuals actually represent them and benefit them. So I'm sure the story is very complex.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eric. Minerva and Nina, now your research focus on South Australia. How might the experiences of Druze communities in other cities and states compare and contrast? And could this broaden the scope of potential findings?
Nina, are you still with us?
We actually thought about looking at Australia-wide to start with, but it is huge. And we know that there are families that live in South Australia, but they have family members like interstate as well. So we've looked at this, and we thought that could be a start, maybe looking at South Australia first and trying to see what else can be done, or if anyone else would like to do interstate. But majority of the Druze, when they arrived to South Australia. And I think that was one of the main reasons. And it's only a few days ago that we both discovered that they have cemeteries in a little urban town in South Australia. Well, it's not little really, but where we are, and they have their own cemeteries, and 30% of the people that pay elections for, that go to election in that town, 30% of the people that live in there are Druze. So this was one of my reasons, but Minerva, if you have anything else to add to that.
And although the Druze community effectively the Australian Druze community rose from South Australia, in recent times, the numbers in New South Wales and in Victoria, Sydney and Melbourne probably are more familiar to you as cities. They have in fact outgrown the Druze communities here in South Australia, and they are not only larger in quantity but also in location. So the ability to actually reach a vast number of these Druze in Melbourne and Sydney has proven to be challenging on many fronts. So we opted to initially start off with South Australia as a case study and then move beyond South Australia in the near future if God permits. Thank you.
Okay, and follow-up question. So you're focused on Lebanese Druze?
We have a significant Druze community, as noted here in South Australia, and predominantly they are Lebanese. However, having said that, in recent times there have been a significant growth in the Syrian Druze community. It's predominantly the Syrian and the Lebanese communities who are represented here within the Druze society at large, and very few, if any, from the Jordanian, Palestinian, Israeli Druze communities in South Australia specifically. So we are reaching out to both the Lebanese and the Syrians here, but the bulk of those who have been interviewed to date are Lebanese.
And can you say that the experiences of both Lebanese and Syrian, are they the same, or can we say they have different experiences?
They certainly have different experiences in terms of the time period that they arrived. So the Syrian Druze generally arrived from the 70s onwards, while the Lebanese Druze arrived prior to that. And also their experiences within community dynamics, internal community dynamics, played a significant role in their settlement. Sadly, as a result of the Lebanese civil war and the role that the Syrian government played in that particular conflict, had a significant impact on many of the Lebanese, particularly those who migrated during the Lebanese civil conflict to Australia, and in turn held quite a significant number of trauma and memories as a result of that conflict. And unfortunately, some of these differences played out within the Syrian Druze communities here in South Australia at various times over the years. There has been a lot of effort in recent years to bring the communities together, and the events in Sweden have certainly contributed to that and benefited the community at large in speaking in one unified voice. On the one hand, in terms of recognising the terrible events that have taken place and the impact it's had on Druze diaspora, but also there's some divisions that have also emerged as a result of the conflict within Sweden and the various factions that are noted, and where their alliances lie, and that in turn is being mirrored here in the South Australian Druze communities, particularly the Syrian communities.
All right, great.
Dr. Timani,
yes,
we do have at least one question from the in-person audience.
Okay, yeah, now we can turn it to the audience. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you both so much, or all of you, for presenting in this session. It was really interesting. Unfortunately, I did have a meeting run long, and I missed the first part of your presentation, Dr. Loeb, but I did read the paper and found it very interesting. But I did have a question, because you kind of end it discussing, how like it remains to be seen kind of what will happen with the Syrian Druze population and their standing within the government, given ongoing developments in the Middle East. But I was wondering, especially in relation to Saab, who we didn't really get the end of his story per se, in the same way that I feel like the other two figures had at least a little bit more of kind of a close on their time in government in Venezuela. So I was wondering, has there been anything since you first submitted that paper? And maybe I missed it from coming in late, but I just wanted to hear if you had any updates on either him as an individual or even the community more broadly, as there's been a little bit more resolution or at least development in Syria since I assume you initially submitted the paper.
Thanks for your question. And just to add a point that there may be a parallel between Venezuela and Australia, where I noticed a lot of mixed marriages and families between Syrian and Lebanese Druze. And so particularly among these political elites, they basically identify with both. So I'm wondering if that may be a phenomenon as well in Australia versus, these being separate communities, or over time, there being more, mix between them. It's something I noticed in Venezuela. But thanks for your question about, Saab's story. In the paper, it really ends at 2023 when this dramatic arrest of al-Assami happens, a member of his own community. And I relate it to the expression of, the famous expression that revolutions eat their own children. Again, thinking about, to what extent that was predicated on power politics versus identity, or even identity-based divergences between the two figures. But I have to follow up more on post-2023 with Saab. I mean, as far as I know, he's still a very prominent figure. As a matter of fact, it's shown that, if anything, there's increased consolidation in the Maduro regime, where I don't know if it's because al-Assami was at one point negotiating with Chevron and trying and becoming more proximate with the United States and trying to push for sanctions relief, if that's something that compromised him, or if there was already political and personal issues happening between him, Maduro, Saab, and others. I'd very much like to speak with, and at one point we actually, had someone from the Venezuelan government, but I wasn't able to speak with him about, why exactly or how exactly this all happened and went down behind the scenes. But nonetheless, I mean, to this day, he's very much one of these central figures and power brokers in the Maduro regime. And like Maduro, I mean, especially now, right? Because one of the points I didn't bring up is that we're seeing, and there's lots of debates on the legalities of this, but we're seeing not only ramping up of maximum pressure and sanctions by the United States and its allies and partners against these individuals, but now military attacks off of Venezuelan shores, vessels that are alleged to be affiliated with drug cartels, right? So these individuals continue to be under tremendous pressure. The regime is consolidating more and more around its loyalists. The question is, what implications is that for its support base if it becomes increasingly narrow like this, inside and outside the state? And then, as you raised, and it's an open question I raised at the end of my presentation, is, to what extent now, although, I think the fall of Assad is more of a factor when it comes to people like al-Assami and others like the parliamentarian El-Zabayar that I profiled in my paper, individuals that really had connections to the region. Whereas for Saab, I don't even know if it's relevant. As I mentioned in my presentation and added to the more recent version of the paper that I didn't share with you, something I discovered, he's deviated from his Druze identity. He's converted to Buddhism. And no point in his curriculum vitae or his profile does he engage with the region. So even though he's a member of the Syrian Lebanese Druze diaspora community, he's very much distanced himself in many ways, personally and politically, from it. And so I think these regional transformations in the Middle East don't necessarily impact him as much as they do with other figures that were interlocutors between Venezuela and state and non-state actors in the region.
Thank you, Eric. Rami, you have any more? So yeah, now from the audience.
I don't think we have any additional questions from the in-person, but we have a bunch of questions from the online audience. So we send that to you, Hussam, so you can go to the chat if you please, and pick any of the questions that you'd like to engage with the discussants about that.
Okay. All right. So question, let's see. Yeah, a question for Minerva and Nina. Why does World War II seem to be such a turning point for Druze immigration in the case you studied? Did you get the question? Are you able to read it?
Like most of the migration that transpired in Australia's short history or short European colonial history, the bulk of migration that took place to Australia was post-World War II, and the Lebanese community and the Druze community were amongst that cohort. So that was very much a turning point. And just to give you an indicator of population increases. So we had a population of approximately 3 million in 1889, a population of approximately 7 million in 1939, and by 1959 we had a population of 10 million. So the bulk of the migrants who entered Australia post-World War II were largely from Europe itself. However, as a result of as a result of the decline of the White Australia policy, which effectively was just focusing on bringing migrants from white European, Anglo-Celtic countries, World War II started to see a shift in that particular demographic, largely because of the need to populate the country and the need to rebuild the country post-World War I and post-World War II.
Okay. All right. Yeah, Eric, there is a question for you. Can you read it or?
I don't know if I could see it actually.
Yeah. Okay. This is I read it for you. One of the question. I noticed that your analysis of Syria used the term violence, given the extensive documentation, testimonies, and even official international reports that describe what occurred as ethnic cleansing, targeting not only Druze but also Alawite and Christians. May I ask why you chose the softer term violence instead of naming it explicitly as ethnic cleansing? Do you believe this linguistic moderation serves analytical precision, or does it risk obscuring the moral and historical reality on the ground? So the term violence, why you used the softer term violence instead of ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a central point of the paper. I'm not trying to, and thank you for the question, first of all. And it's an important one, obviously, as these events unfold, and obviously very impactful. It's a side point about, just Asweda getting, attention recently over these events. And I mean, I myself, spent time in Syria and follow the history and politics. We could debate the semantics. I'm really not coming down on one side or the other. And even, I've seen Syrian analysts and scholars who are more familiar with Syria and from Syria, or actually Syrians, who even object to the term sectarian violence, and see it as being reductionist. With the dynamics not just between the HTS government and a very specific Druze faction. It's not the whole Druze population, as you probably know better than me, that was involved. Although, again, the Shara-led government may not have distinguished between those factions when, as events on the ground unfolded, but also involved, Bedouin tribes as well. And so, it's a complex situation. And again, just like we're having these discussions about Gaza and elsewhere, right, in terms of not just what occurred on the ground, but what the actual intentionality is. And again, whether this is all the way at the top of the leadership around al-Shara and others, or whether, you know, again, it's a question of the government losing control of some more radical factions, some more radical extremist militants within their ranks. You know, in terms of was the intent, and is this well established that there was a campaign of ethnic cleansing there? Again, if someone says yes, I wouldn't push back or object to it. But it's something I said in passing in terms of why Asweda is getting this attention. And then, of course, we can debate the semantics about, you know, whether this constitutes sectarian violence, ethnic cleansing, or something else. Thank you for the question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, also, this is another question for Nina and Minerva. The question is that I'm noticing larger and larger cohorts of Australian Druze traveling to the United States in the recent years for the American Druze Society events, as well as independent Druze community events through the US. Have you noted this growth and or desire towards transnational connection and collaboration in your work with Australian Druze communities?
Yes. So perhaps Nina, do you want to go first and then I'll follow on?
Well, I think it's, I think what's been happening also in the world is impacting on this, and people are communicating. It's easier. People can share different ideas. People are more interested in histories and are more interested in building up connections within their cultural groups. That's one way of looking at it. I don't know, Minerva, what would make that a little bit more explicit?
No, thank you very much for the question. And certainly from the experience noted in this study, but prior to the study commencing, I certainly did notice this shift taking place. And I would perhaps note that through my observations that those that are pushing this particular connection, this transnational connection, and those that are participating are predominantly second generation Druze Australians as opposed to first generations. And if there are first generation Druze who are participating, they usually may have come here at a very young age and very much see themselves or identify themselves as Australian more than perhaps the country that they were born in. So this desire for identity and a sense of belonging and is quite high amongst the second generation Druze Australians from my discussions and interactions with them, but also the fact that their parents, generally first generation Druze Australians or Australian Druze, have been pushing the fact that they need to continue the intermarriage practice that many Druze generally follow, although having said that, there are an increasing number of Druze who are marrying out, but those that do participate in these events generally come from families where the retention of Druze identity and values and practices are quite high. So I think that will be a factor that's very much pushing this interest, along with what Nina said earlier. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I guess we have 5 more minutes and have one more question here to Eric. The question is that you mentioned the complexities and contradictions between Venezuelan socialism and Islamism, maybe referring to Iran and Hamas, that arise in the relations that you examine. Are there ways that Venezuelan socialism and Islamism and the Islamism of Syria and Iran actually interface with each other or align in values? Does that affect the relations you examined? I don't know if you...
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Ali. I meant to think about them as separate concepts, socialism and Islamism. It's the complexities and contradictions first with Islamism is that some of these many members, I can't quantify, but members of the Syrian and even Lebanese Druze diaspora community in Venezuela don't sympathize with Islamists, and if anything, they have been persecuted by them at different times, and yet those who have come into power from this community have actually interfaced with them. Of course, we could distinguish between Sunni extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS who see the Druze as heretics and as targets, whereas the Islamists that the Venezuelan government and members of this community, at least political elites from this community, have engaged with, Hezbollah, and to some extent Hamas, but particularly Hezbollah, has a complicated relationship with the Druze, where at times it's as a political actor in Lebanon, a military actor, it's had accommodation with the Druze, and at times there's been a more antagonistic relationship, right? So this brings up all types of complexities in terms of this relationship between not necessarily the community at the societal level, but these individuals from the community who have entered the state and then have worked with these groups. The second thing about socialism is that, as I mentioned in the presentation, is that older generations have fled the region. They fled authoritarian socialist states that were in vogue at the time of the Cold War, and saw Venezuela as an alternative to that pre-Chavez. At the same time, there were individuals like al-Assami's father, who was affiliated with leftist groups in the region and the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, and actually embraced socialism. And so, as a consequence, al-Assami had a personal connection and affinity towards socialism when he was at the university. And so there's a contradiction there as well. And then also, even where Venezuela embraces socialism, although again, we can maybe argue that they deviated from it. Maybe they talk about it in name, but over time, it's become very much a crony capitalistic regime and highly corrupt at that. The same thing happened in countries like Syria and Iran, where at one point socialism was very much in vogue during the Cold War, but then over time, Syria talked about transitioning under even the regime of Hafez al-Assad from a socialist economy to a social market economy. And during the 1980s in Iran and the Islamic Republic, socialism was at its heyday in the 1980s and then has kind of just lost momentum since then. So these countries, they get together, they speak about socialism, they talk about an alternative to capitalism and to really talking about an alternative system to US hegemony in their respective regions. But at the end of the day, it's an open question, and it's a complex one and filled with contradictions to what extent they're actually socialist actors and entities at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's interesting, is that Druze were fleeing that socialism in Syria, and they ended up embracing it in Venezuela. So that's interesting. All right, I guess we can take one more question. Let's see. Yeah, this is for Minerva and Nina. Okay. Does the Druze identity have an impact on the ties between Lebanese and Israeli Druze in Australia?
I have to say myself, I have never met personally a Druze from Israel, but I know, been listening to certain podcasts and from few sheikh that are speaking at the moment about the Druze, And I understand that there is a lot of connections between the two, and we've been hearing so much about the Druze experiences in Israel and what's happening as well, of them being not allowed to go to Lebanon to visit family members if they married from there and things. But these things are some of the things that I haven't heard of before, and now they're becoming public, and people are even talking about them in the open space. Minerva, do you have anything to add?
Thanks, Nina. Certainly from my understanding, there are no Druze from Palestine, Israel here in South Australia. I'm not too sure in terms of migration to New South Wales, Victoria or any other states in Australia, whether that is also the case. Having said that, certainly the events of the last 2 years following October 7th, 2023, the fact that many people are being educated about the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict online through social media platforms, the fact that some of the IDF soldiers are of Druze heritage themselves has brought about quite a lot of online social media hatred towards the Druze on one level, but also provided some context in terms of the status of Druze in Israel and how that's being navigated amongst the local Druze communities here in Australia is very fascinating in itself, and that's a whole different project and conversation in itself. But that certainly is something that's being discussed within the Druze communities here, particularly in light of the developments that have occurred in Sweden in recent months. So it's an ongoing conversation, and I think people, particularly those of second and third generation Australian backgrounds, are trying to work out how they comprehend these various aspects of Druze identity and some of the realities that Druze face in various countries within the MENA region. Thank you.
All right, great. Actually, our time is up, and I know we have more questions, and my apology that we won't be able to do more questions. But big thank you to our presenters, Minerva, Nina, and Eric, and to the audience. And Rami, it's yours now. Send it to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hussam Timani, and for our panelists, and for a wonderful conversation about a usually neglected topic about Druze diaspora communities. 2 years ago, during our symposium here at KU, we had, I think, only one presentation of one paper about the Druze diaspora in the US. Now we have an actual panel. We were expecting 3 presentations. Two of them were wonderful, about the Druze in Venezuela, the other one about the Druze in Australia. Lovely conversation. Unfortunately, the third presenter was supposed to talk about Druze diaspora communities and their aid in Europe, which was fascinating, especially that it was going to focus on the Druze in Syria, which is a timely thing in relation to the recent events. But unfortunately, the third speaker was not able to join. I heard from him the last time a month ago, and he said he had to go back to his family in Sweden. So probably because of that, he's not able to join us. But I think this is a testament of how this Druze studies field is growing, and also adding this component of the diaspora communities around the world. So I look forward to see these papers being published in the future. And I would like to use this moment to conclude our first day. On the shared screen, you can see the list of the many departments that are helping us run this event today. As you know, there are not many centers or departments or programs in universities worldwide that focus on the Druze. I'm lucky to be here at the University of Kansas, where this initiative is being supported. And this list over here, those who are supporting this initiative this year with this conference, I would like to thank them all for their support.